What I want to give is an account of what is happening in Zambia. My government is proud to join other delegates at the 6th Global Congress on Combating Counterfeit and Piracy. Maybe to make it lighter, on a lighter note, the issue of counterfeit and piracy in our situation is something that has come to be accepted to some level, because there's even been coined a local word for it, and everybody understands that. So it gets to a choice of making an economic decision. Do I buy what is genuine? Do I buy what is going to allow me to do what I want to do with what is available? Zambia, like many other developing countries, has been a dumping ground for counterfeit and pirated products. The counterfeiting and piracy has spread to serious products such as medicines, which at the moment pose a health hazard to our people. Motor vehicle spares are also now a subject of counterfeiting, spreading the danger to the lives of our citizens. And therefore, as a government, we welcome the strategies aimed at fighting the scourge at global level. We have revised all laws pertaining to industrial property and copyright. We have also approved the intellectual property policy that will direct the administration of intellectual property in Zambia. And among the pieces of legislation enacted to enhance the fight against counterfeit and piracy is the Copyright and Performance Rights Act of 2010, which or whose features demand that one, there should be a security or hologram affixed on all audio and video products to be sold in the country. And also, copyright will be vested in the Attorney General in the absence of the owner for purposes of prosecuting an offense. The government has also created the Intellectual Property Unit under the Zambia Police Service to fight intellectual property crimes. And we have also an ad hoc body called the Anti-Piracy Crack Squad, which comprises law enforcement officers from the Zambia Revenue Authority to enforce the law at the points of entry. As I conclude, I would want to commend the World Intellectual Property Organization for the technical support it has continued to render to us. But I would also want to raise the issue of at which point are we going to make sure that this implementation process is going to work. With all that we have put in place, we are still getting this, and we are facing the question of what is economic for the people that are in the third world, in that we receive, and from the source, if these things still get into our countries, then I don't know how else the enforcement can be done. Thank you.
Thank you. You're excellent for this statement. Other statements, comments? Please, the panelists, also consider yourselves as part of the audience for purposes of the discussion. So I invite you also to make statements or comments on the various issues which we've raised in our discussion. I see another request for the floor. Please identify yourself before you make your statement.
Yes, hello. My name is Michelle Forsley. I'm a professor at Widener School of Law and a lawyer and work in the field of global health, work in the medicines access arena. So I watched this question of the relationship between a social agenda of access to medicines and intellectual property quite closely and have for many years. And I'm now observing the development agenda and its relationship to IP enforcement and protection. And what I'd like to ask the panelists is specifically, what could each of you envision as a kind of empirical study that would identify the links between development or lack thereof and intellectual property? And with a particular reference to, and I'd like each of you to answer this question for your areas of expertise and domains, and I hope that we can all avoid falling into the trap to use poverty as a justification for a reduction in rights protection, because I don't think that's necessarily the answer. I've heard in recent discussions that somehow development should allow for copying or other forms of perhaps mild infringement that should be allowed somehow, because it's the way in which people grow their business. I don't particularly buy this approach, but I'd like to hear each of you talk about what you could see as a research project that would give us rigorous empirical evidence to show us where the conflicts are, the tensions are, because I think this field suffers greatly from the lack of empirical evidence. And thank you very much for your comments.
Your question, who would like to go ahead with answering or reacting? Ricardo?
Thank you, and thank you for that question. I think I would not give you the project that you're looking for, because I would also like to hear from someone how we go about it. But we have been doing some work trying to get there and understand really that very complex relationship between IP generally and development. In terms of enforcement specifically, there are some attempts. We published one by a review of literature and work that is available out there by Karsten Fink a couple of years ago, and even the what is it called, the Government Accounting Office, the GAO in the U.S. Would acknowledge that it's incredibly difficult to really come to conclusions on the effects of enforcement of IP. Particularly from an economy-wide perspective. There are so many different ways of infringement, and there are so many actors involved, and so there are different industries, there are different agendas, consumers, etc., and it's very hard. But I think intuitively, from the development perspective, we know that it's not only the harm that has been now mentioned several times on public health, for instance, in the case of counterfeit drugs, but it's also the harm that counterfeit may cause to a nascent or very early an industry in early development, which is trying to connect with international production networks and trying to participate in supply chains. And so, for instance, from that perspective, there's a development impact that it's quite important. But I wanted to also say something very quickly about what the minister said, and I think it has to do with resources for enforcement. And I think that the question that continues to be asked, and I think is one that merits more exploration, is where should the burden for enforcement be, particularly if you're a developing country, and obviously you have competing priorities on the use of the resources that you have, the scarce resources that you have, but also because institutionally, many of the public goods with respect to law, with respect to governance, institutions, and so on, are under-provided in many of these countries. And so should you put the resources in enforcement of IP, or should those resources be perhaps provided by those that are more directly affected and particularly, again, the private right holders, or perhaps even developed countries, should they subsidize the capacity to enforce? And again, I know that this is a simplification of something that is much more complex, but enforcement in the development context is also something that cannot be in a selected manner. So you cannot build institutions to enforce IP when you don't have institutions that could provide for innovation policies, for technology, for industrial policies, and so on. So it has to be seen in a much broader context as well. But I just wanted to highlight that question of the financing of enforcement, which is a very important one from a development perspective.
Thank you, Ricardo. Yes, IP enforcement in the broader context of policy choices. I see Aline is taking the microphone.